The sport of boxing has a serious drug testing problem, and it seems like nobody really cares. Canelo Alvarez, Tyson Fury, Billy Joe Saunders, Oscar Valdez, and Roy Jones Jr., along with other boxing stars, have all at one point tested positive for performance-enhancing drugs or banned substances. I think the most recent and most prominent case of this is when Canelo Alvarez tested positive for clenbuterol, which is not necessarily a performance-enhancing drug, but it is a banned substance as it helps in fat and weight loss while also helping the user to build lean muscle. Now, Canelo Alvarez had this positive test result before his Triple G rematch back in 2018, and though this did get a lot of press, it never really put the Triple G rematch into jeopardy. And though the argument from Canelo's camp and his supporters is that he was contaminated from Mexican meat, I still find it interesting and somewhat concerning that a lot of boxers, when they do test positive for something, the repercussions, especially compared to other sports, is very minimal, and the event kind of goes on like nothing ever happened. So the more research I did for this video, the more I found that the drug testing in boxing is an absolute joke, and the system potentially allows boxers to get away with a lot. So without further ado, let me demonstrate how broken the drug testing system is in boxing. So for new fans to boxing, the sport is essentially split up into 4 major belt organizations who basically commission fights under their belt. Essentially, if a fighter is fighting for one of their belts, they have to follow their rules. And one of the rules each fighter has to follow is some form of anti-doping policy, which is different from each major organization. So for example, the WBC has something called the Clean Boxer Program, which with the help of VADA, a drug testing program that I'll get into later, is meant to test for and prevent boxers from taking performance-enhancing drugs and other banned substances. Now, something like the Clean Boxer Program sounds good on the outside, but it does have a slew of problems, and many have claimed that it's just a front for the WBC. A lot of boxers who have had fights under the WBC commission have claimed they've never been tested from the WBC, and a very good example of this was when Jermell Charlo, before his fight with Brian Castano, had to request for the WBC to drug test Castano. He also claimed that the drug testing by the WBC, despite them being in the Clean Boxer Program, was extremely lax, and that he was only drug tested once right before his fight. Meanwhile, in the WBO, their drug testing policy is essentially testing fighters right before or right after an event, and they do not test outside of competition. Or in other words, it's very easy for a boxer to cheat by taking banned substances or performance-enhancing drugs and getting it out of their system before that small window of time they're actually tested. As for the IBF and the WBA, they're very similar in the WBO in that they do not test year-round and they only test around the event day. Though similar to the WBC, they have their own drug testing program in partnership with VADA, which claims that it mitigates the number of boxers cheating. So I've been mentioning VADA a lot now, and it seems like a lot of the major organizations use VADA in accordance with their program to try to stop boxers from cheating. But is it really effective? So essentially, VADA is the organization that does the actual drug testing and has the labs and is able to detect if boxers are cheating or not. But the funny thing is, and the thing I didn't really want to spoil, is that the V in VADA literally stands for voluntary. The voluntary aspect of this anti-doping association defeats the purpose of drug testing in general. Even though these VADA-powered programs within these belt organizations are required before they can fight for that organization's belt, there are no requirements when it comes to when you have to sign up for VADA, and many have speculated that fighters who do use PEDs or banned substances will wait until those things are out of their system. And this is not even the worst part. The more ridiculous part is that even with these lax drug testing policies from VADA, it's ultimately up to the belt organization or the commission to make a decision on a positive result from VADA. And depending on how big a boxing star is, this may mean a boxer who does test positive from a VADA test can ultimately just get a slap on the wrist or no punishment at all, depending on the commission. Take for example the time Oscar Valdez tested positive for a banned substance before his fight commissioned by the WBC. Even though Oscar Valdez took something that was considered a banned substance by VADA, the WBC did not consider what he took to be a performance-enhancing drug. So this really shows the lack of integrity and corruption that is the WBC, because what was the whole point of hiring VADA if you're just going to decide which drugs are performance enhancing or banned, and you're basically just going to pick and choose which positive tests actually impact an event? Let me remind you that the WBC and these other organizations are not experts on performance enhancing drugs or banned substances, so the whole point of hiring VADA was to have an objective third party who are experts in performance enhancing drugs to decide whether or not the substance that they test positive for is considered cheating or not. This also happened back in 2012 when Lamont Peterson failed a drug test under the IBF and was not only allowed to keep his IBF title, but he was also ordered to be a mandatory fight for Zab Judah. So not only did the IBF let Lamont Peterson keep his title, but he was also given a fight right after. Insane. So at the end of the day, even if there is some form of drug testing that is required for fighters, the commission can always make up an excuse or always try to justify why they did not punish a fighter for testing positive. Now this is in stark contrast to how the UFC drug tests their fighters. The funny thing is, most UFC fighters actually complain that they get tested way too much by the UFC and their anti-doping program they use called USADA. Unlike boxing and VADA, the UFC and USADA will test their fighters year-round, randomly, 24/7. If you're a UFC fan, you've probably heard the stories of fighters getting tested by USADA at any point in the day, whether it be before an event, after an event, or even out of training camp in general. A really good example is Paulo Costa, who is one of the most tested fighters in the UFC, has said that he's been woken up by USADA at 3 a.m. And in 2020, despite only fighting once, Jon Jones was tested 25 times in that year. So for my non-UFC fans, you're probably wondering, how effective was USADA and this extreme form of testing? And the simple answer is, it's extremely effective. I'd recommend looking up videos of post-USADA bodies or post-USADA meltdowns, but basically a lot of freak athletes such as Vitor Belfort, Alistair Overeem, and Johnny Hendricks all kind of had this insane transformation after USADA. Now it's really hard to find the specific numbers and data regarding USADA's impact on the UFC, but I think many UFC fans can agree that USADA has definitely helped prevent fighters from using PEDs, and it is a cleaner sport because of it. So naturally the question arises, why doesn't boxing have a stricter drug testing policy, and why does it seem like they don't really care if a boxer tests positive for a performance enhancing drug or banned substance? The simple answer is, and the answer that you're going to hear for all of my videos, is how boxing is structured, especially in comparison to the UFC and other sports. Boxing is so dependent on the main event that they cannot risk one of those fighters pulling out due to anything, whether it be an injury or, in this case, a positive drug test. See, in most other sports, if an athlete, even if they are a big star, tests positive for something, they will get a very harsh suspension, but their team will continue to play other teams, or some type of event following the positive test result will still continue to happen. And the same can be said in the UFC. Even though a main event fighter can test positive and can get banned, and this could be a huge detriment to the event can still go on. Since the UFC has more control over its fighters, they can easily get a solid replacement for the main event. And additionally, because the event did not solely center around the main event, you can still have a really solid undercard, making the event still salvageable even if the main event fighter pulls out. And this is the polar opposite in boxing, where each event solely relies on the main event. This also means that the undercard is usually very weak, because all of the time and resources are spent on the main event because it is the main draw. So imagine if one of the main event fighters, when testing positive for a drug, has to pull out of the fight. Essentially, the whole event has fallen through. For one, there is no way that the commission or promoters are going to get a good enough replacement for the main event, as it takes months or even years for a fight to be made between two star fighters, let alone only a couple days or a couple weeks before an event. And there's no way they can salvage the event with the undercard because it's usually weak to begin with. So another thing I wanted to point out is that the USADA testing and year-round testing is extremely expensive. You've probably heard by now that UFC fighters get paid much less than boxers, but it's because the UFC takes a lot of the revenue built from these events and puts it into things such as USADA. Meanwhile, in boxing, I think the commission/organizations, the promoters, and even the fighters would rather take that revenue and put it right back into their pockets instead of spending it on something expensive such as year-round testing like USADA. So what do you guys think? I thought this was a really interesting topic, and it really shows that drug testing in boxing is a joke in comparison to most other sports. Please leave your thoughts in the comments below, and please continue to subscribe because I will continue to upload every week.